So then Mills says, well, if we were to actually interview people after one of these situations, they would and we asked them, why did you do what you did? Why did you give money to that homeless person? Why did you flip off the person in traffic? Why did you say hello to your boss that way? They will give us an answer, but this answer won't be the quote-unquote true sociological reason why something happened. No, instead, it'll be an answer drawn from what Mills called vocabularies of motives. So in other words, if I ask somebody, hey, I just saw you give some money to that homeless person, why'd you do it? They may say something along the lines of, well, they looked hungry. And Mills writes that down and he says, okay, that's an interesting vocabulary. And then he keeps observing people doing it, and he finds that people are oftentimes going to say the same thing. Oh, the person looked hungry. Oh, the person looked hungry. But then every once in a while, you'll hear some other explanations. Well, because I believe in social justice. Okay, interesting. You might hear a couple of people say that. Yeah, I gave money because I believe in social justice. Or you might hear somebody come along and say, well, I followed the example of Dorothy Day, who was a Catholic activist in the 1940s through 1960s. And she said that person might be the angelic presence of the divine. Oh, okay. And so a sociologist writes all these down, and what he realizes is that that one exact same action, giving money to the homeless person, is explained by all sorts of vocabularies of motives. And because of the diversity of these vocabularies of motives, we can't actually say that those motives that people articulate are what actually cause the action. Instead, these vocabularies, places where we might try and find values, are actually used to describe what people have already done. So in the classic definition of Weber and Parsons and Mills, they argued that value, so V, caused action, A. Mills is arguing that the case may be that action occurs and that people use vocabularies of motives or vocabularies of values to, action doesn't cause those values, but action and values are kind of delinked. I'll put a dotted line there. And that these vocabularies of motives are used to then talk back about action that has just occurred. So Mills is saying, you know what? Values don't cause action. That's his argument here. And what he's saying, what he's pointing out, is that the language that we use to get through the course of our life helps us to understand what we have done. And these become vague, these vocabularies of motives may help us a little bit indirectly in shaping how we act in the future, but that there's no direct connection from values to action. So if you're brought up in a school or in a church or in your family, you may pick up different vocabularies of motives, and hence those three different explanations that a sociologist on the street recorded people saying as why they gave to homeless people. And those vocabularies may have been shaped by some different types of values, but it's, at the end of the day, it's still the same action. It's still giving money to a homeless person. Mills argues what values matters for is just helping us understand why we've acted. So it's a pretty kind of not cynical view of values, but it's a view saying, hey, as sociologists, values don't cause action, and we need to be careful by looking at people's motive, by asking for people's motives or intents. We need to be careful and not regard those as actually causing the action. Instead, what they are is helpful ways for us to understand how language is a part of social life and helps people understand action they've done before and action that they may do in the future. So the quick summary here is that values are hard to get at. In most of the situations of life, people are acting in situations in a way that they're meeting the demands of the situation, or they're using scripts. This is another way to think about what Mills is saying, kind of pre-coded, pre-written ways of getting through a situation. And then finally, Mills argues that values, in the Shills and Parsons sense of being this internal part of who we are, really are not good for explaining action. They aren't some sort of thing that can, from the outside, that have gotten into people that can then explain why an action happened. So Mills has said that model of action just doesn't work anymore. So that's argument number 2 against using values as a way to understand culture. Let's get to argument number 3. And then after this one, after we've completely demolished the idea of values, I'm going to take you back and say, well, actually, there are some ways to use values in sociology. But let's hear argument number 3 first. Argument number 3 comes from a sociologist by the name of Ann Swidler in a famous article in 1986. Okay. And Swidler starts off with a couple of puzzles. The first puzzle she points out is that Weber, as we saw last week, has this really articulate, sophisticated, interesting way of thinking about values. If you recall, Weber's argument is that an idea that can be like a switchman, can cause action, can cause economics and politics, which he saw as driving most action, can cause them to start to be done in a different way. And the way that happens is these new ideas, like this Protestant idea of salvation, sets kind of a different goal, which then creates these sort of medium-range values or ways that we go about doing our action, which he called an ethic. And his most famous one was this Protestant work ethic. But what Swidler does is she takes a little bit longer look at history, and she says, well, Weber, that's kind of interesting. And she says, Weber's argument is really on the course of time. So if this arrow is time and we're in 2012, she says, well, Weber's argument, I mean, it's kind of interesting, but it's kind of based on things, on looking at the rise of capitalism, looking at the Protestant Reformation, which happened in the early 1500s, and which was really in full-bore, full-blown action, historical event in the 1600s. So she's saying, okay, well, he's saying that that's when this Protestant work ethic thing happened. But, she says, Weber, if you had merely picked up a book, say by a guy named Benjamin Franklin, writing in the early 1800s, so 200 to 300 years later, you would see that by the time Franklin is writing, and Franklin was known for writing these really, well, actually for kind of keeping a diary of what he did, and for writing all sorts of kind of aphorisms about hard work and self-sufficiency and this sort of thing. If you were to read, Swidler says, Weber, if you were to read Ben Franklin's, you would realize that by the time we get to Ben Franklin in the 1800s, all we have left from this Protestant work ethic is a work ethic. She looks at some of Franklin's writings, and she points out that by the 1800s, the religious part of it's gone. So that big goal idea thing that in Weber's scheme was out there, and we were orienting ourselves and developing kind of specific values of hard work and self-sufficiency to get toward. She says, by the time we read Franklin, that religious piece is gone. That big idea piece is gone. And instead, all we have is kind of this kind of ethic, but it's really just kind of a set of behaviors. It's no longer these kind of articulated values that made sense because they had this Protestant idea of salvation standing out there somewhere in the future. So she says, if that's the case, if the guiding value, the guiding idea is no longer a part of the work ethic, then what is the use of values? What's the use of values if by the time Benjamin Franklin comes around, they don't seem to be a part of the ethic anymore. They're not a part of what we're actually observing. The other really hardcore argument she has against values is that if you take Parsons and Shills completely at their word, then values are a part of everything. So remember that GPS or that compass example I gave. So in Parsons and Shills, values are both the poles of the magnetic Earth, but they're also the GPS or the compass unit that's inside of us. And she says, well, if that's the way you describe values, then values are everywhere, at every moment, involved in everything, both guiding society as well as individuals. And logically, or in using the scientific method, if you can use one concept, values, to try and explain absolutely everything, then there's no way to test it. If it's supposedly everywhere, influencing everything at every moment, then there's no way to test whether that's true or not. And therefore, values isn't really a concept that helps us understand anything. We can't actually know, as social scientists, whether it's influencing action at all or whether it's influencing society at all, because these guys, Parsons and Shills, have said, it's always there, it's always happening. So we kind of can't test that theory of theirs. So Swidler, in response, develops a pretty famous argument in sociology, which comes to be known as the toolkit approach to culture. Now let me pause here really quick. I'll come right back and I'll finish up this piece.